Does anybody here have an irrational fear of anything? Right? If you have an irrational fear of something, raise your hand. Some of you are willing to admit it. The rest of you are afraid to. Some of you have maybe an irrational fear of something like spiders. Right? Some of you are deathly afraid of spiders. This is one I've never really understood because spiders are this big. And most of them want to be our friends. They want to help us, but we just squish them. Some of you maybe are afraid of snakes. This one I understand a little bit better because since Genesis 3, snakes have been evil. And snakes can do some real damage, and so I can understand that. I have an irrational fear myself, and this is hard because I'm trying to be authentic with you, and so try not to laugh at me. My irrational fear, and this is a really big fear for me, is of polyurethane foam. I don't know if you know what that is. That's the stuff that's in your couch cushions, and actually these chairs you're sitting on, these are full of polyurethane foam. I don't know what it is about polyurethane foam. There's something about the feel of it. I'm actually getting a little bit jittery just talking about it. But if I touch it with my fingertips, it makes my teeth hurt. You know how when somebody scratches a chalkboard with their nails? But how many of you don't know what that's like? Because you guys all have whiteboards now. All right, so if you're my age, you remember somebody scratched a chalkboard with their nails, that awful feeling. That's what polyurethane foam does to me. And if I'm really having a hard time with this. If someone like rubs their hand across the polyurethane foam, if I just see that happen, it just deeply disturbs me. And my teeth are starting to hurt just talking about it, so I need to move on. But so my kids found this out. They figured this out about me. And so there would be times like we'd be washing the couch cushions, so you have to take the covers off to wash them. And so now you've just got these big squares of polyurethane foam. And my kids, because they love me so much, would grab these squares and chase me around the house trying to rub. And this was deathly afraid for me because I did not want to touch them. Now that's irrational fear, right? And we all have irrational fears like this. But sometimes our fears are not irrational, right? Sometimes we're afraid of things that maybe we should be afraid of or that are real. Usually fear goes along with a two-word sentence, two-word statement. What if? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this person does this? What if I do this? What if I end up here? What if? What if? What if? That's the word that accompanies our fear. And probably all of us have experienced times in life when those what if questions, those fear questions, kind of start to grow and they mount up, and we discover that our fear becomes almost all-consuming, that we feel like it's taking over our lives. And even if it's a rational fear, that's a place we never want to be. Fear is bad for us. Fear actually has negative health implications for you if you live in a state of fear. It can be bad for your digestive tract. It can be bad for your cardiovascular system. It's bad for your heart. Fear can be bad for your relationships. Rick Warren said in one of his sermons that fear can destroy relationships because fear takes us to these places of disappointment and distance and being demanding. And maybe you've experienced that where your fear has led you to kind of withdraw from the people you love because fear can be very negative in our lives. You know, one of the things we like to say as Christians when we talk about fear is to say the antidote for fear is to trust God. And that's true. All right, that's true. We should trust God, and trusting God is the antidote for fear. But how often have you heard that and thought, I don't know what that means? I hear that, trust God. I don't know what it means to trust God. How do I do that? Because it sounds like you're just throwing out this nice platitude at me, something you might find on a postcard or a plaque that you hang on your wall, but how does this apply to my life today? How do I trust God in this moment, in this time? This morning, we're going to continue our series talking about David. And we're going to talk about a time in David's life when fear was overwhelming. All right? But what we're going to talk about is what did it mean for David to actually trust God? And here's what I hope I can do this morning. I hope that when we're all done this morning, you'll be able to leave here not just with an idea that, yeah, I should trust God and have this feeling of trust, but that I can give you some practical action steps that you can take to demonstrate your trust in God. Because trust is not just a feeling or an emotion. Trust is manifested when we do something. And so I hope that's where we'll get today. Now, you know that we've been working our way through the life of David. And we're right now going to be in a passage of David's life from 2 Samuel 14 to 19. We often think about this as the time of Absalom's rebellion. There's a lot of chapters here, so we're not going to read all of it verse by verse. I hope you'll go back on your own and do that. You can use the YouVersion Bible app, and if you open our live event there, you'll find that not only are all the verses listed that you can read the whole story, but there's some helpful thoughts to be thinking about as you do that. But let me give you a quick overview of the story, all right? Quick overview of the story. There's really three parts to this story: Absalom's conspiracy, David's response, and God's intervention. Now, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, we talked about this awful story where David's son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. And then Tamar's brother, Absalom, Amnon's half-brother, killed Amnon to get revenge. Having killed Amnon, he knew he was in trouble, and so Absalom fled the country. He left the kingdom. And now he's been living up north kind of in hiding. That's kind of where the story begins in chapter 14. David's most trusted general, Joab, brokers a peace, kind of, between David and Absalom. He convinces Absalom to come back to Jerusalem, but even though he's back, Absalom doesn't visit the palace for a couple of years. Finally, Absalom and David are reunited, and Absalom is invited to come back to the palace. And that's when he kind of starts to set his plan in motion. He sets himself up to be very visible to all of the people, so that they see him and know that's the son of the king. He's next in line for the throne. He's very impressive. And Absalom would sit at the gate of the city where people would come to bring their problems, and he would take David's place there. And as people would arrive, he would say, "Hey, how can I help you today?" And the person would say, "Well, I have this dispute with my neighbor, and I need someone to resolve it." And Absalom would say something like, "Well, you know, the king is very busy, and I'm sure he'd like to help you, but he can't. But if I were judge of the land, I would love to help you." And person by person, relationship by relationship, intervention by intervention, Absalom began to steal the hearts of the people. That's what it says in 2 Samuel 15, that Absalom stole the hearts of the people. Now, I have a hard time with this. Remember, we're talking about King David here, right? The greatest king of Israel's ever known. The guy who killed Goliath. He is a legend in his own time. Remember, when David was young, the people used to sing a song about him? They say, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s." Under David's rule, Israel never lost a battle. Under David's rule, the empire grew and expanded. They had great peace and prosperity. So why are the people so willing to leave David and follow Absalom? This is a great reminder that people are fickle. And if you put all your hope and trust in people, if you find your satisfaction in your own reputation, in what people think of you, you are sure to be disappointed. Because no one person you will ever know is as worthy of your trust as God. So Absalom stole the hearts of the people. He left Jerusalem, went to a city, Hebron, where he set himself up as king. He crowned himself king and called the people of Israel to come to him, and they did. They gathered to Absalom, and he raised up a massive army and began to march towards Jerusalem. When David heard the news, he realized that he didn't have the fighting force he needed to defend Jerusalem, to defend the throne, to defend himself. And so he decided it's time for us to leave. Let's evacuate the city. So David took all of his family, all of his servants, all of his closest fighting men, and away they went. Now, on your own, you can read this fascinating account in 2 Samuel 15 and 16. As David was leaving the city, he had several conversations with people that reveal amazing things about David's character and teach us incredible lessons about our own. Now, I would recommend that you take some time this week and read those chapters. And if you look in your program, you'll see the follow-up questions you have this week all deal with those conversations that David had. Now, many of you do this in your small group, so you'll have a chance to do that. But even if you're not in a group or your group doesn't use those questions, take a little bit of time this week and look those over and see what you can't learn from David and these conversations he had while he was running away. Well, ultimately, David escapes. He and his men wait for the right time, and then there's a final battle. And in that final battle, God steps in and intervenes. Because even though David's men are greatly outnumbered, and honestly, if you do the math, you realize David's men were kind of old by this point. Probably 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and they're fighting 20 and 30-year-olds, but God gives them a great victory. He intervenes on their behalf. Absalom is killed in the battle. David is restored to king. Now, if you look at this story, the three parts of this story, Absalom's conspiracy, David's response, God's intervention, this is probably a pattern all of us have walked through in our life at some point. Have you ever had that sense that life is conspiring against you? Things are going wrong. People are out to get you. Nothing seems to be happening like it should. Life is conspiring against me. Now, when you have that experience, often that's what induces fear, right? The what-if questions. Well, what if this keeps happening? What if this goes terribly wrong? What if I don't know how to respond? And ultimately, we all have to respond. And what I want to suggest to you this morning is that the proper response in these times is trust. And the reason is because we know that God will intervene. So what we're going to talk about this morning, using the life of David as an example, we're going to talk about what it looks like to trust God in terrifying times. Because these were certainly terrifying times for David. David realized that he could lose everything. He could lose his kingdom. He could lose his throne. He could lose his crown. He could lose his family. He could lose his friends. He could lose his life. And I'm sure for David, the what-if questions were running through his mind like crazy. What if? What if? What if? So how did David trust God in these terrifying times? To start, we're going to go to the book of James. Okay, this is in the New Testament. And in James chapter 5, I want you to hear what James writes about trusting God. He says this, "Dear brothers and sisters, be patient as you wait for the Lord's return. Consider the farmers who patiently wait for the rains in the fall and in the spring. They eagerly look for the valuable harvest to ripen. You too must be patient. Take courage, for the coming of the Lord is near." James uses a picture here of a farmer. Now, a farmer, they plant their seeds in the spring. But they don't expect the harvest in the spring, right? They know that once they plant the seeds, they have to wait. They have to wait for the rains to come. They have to wait for the crops to grow. And after they've waited a time, the crops will grow and the harvest will be ready in the fall. James says that's what trust is. Trust is realizing that what's happening today is not the end of the story. That what I'm dealing with right now is not the final chapter. I need to wait for something more to happen. And James points us to the coming of Jesus as that thing for which we're most waiting. He says Jesus is coming. And when Jesus comes, we know that he'll set all things right. He'll make all things new. There will be no more weeping, no more sadness, no more death, no more illness. He's going to fix everything. And we're waiting for that. But James says while you wait, there's two pieces of this. There's patience. You need to wait because you know that something better is coming. And so trusting God does mean having patience. It means waiting to see what God is going to do. But it's not just passively waiting. It's not apathy. It's not me sitting back and saying what's going to happen next. Because James says there's also this active element to trust. He says, take courage. Courageously take action. Step into life. Live the life God has called you to live. That's what it means to trust God. So if I want to trust God in terrifying times, it means I have to be patient while I wait, but I also have to courageously act. And what we're going to see in David's life is that he did both. He patiently waited for God to step in and intervene, but he also courageously acted where he could. Let me give you 3 ideas today, or 3 suggestions today of what you can do to patiently wait and to courageously act. How you can trust God even in the midst of fear. And it starts here. Choose self-control. Choose self-control. There are many things in life that you cannot control. You can always control yourself. Right? I say this to my kids. Don't be controlled by the things you can't control. You're walking through life, something happens, there are words you want to say, right? You can't always control what those words might be that you want to say, but you can control whether or not you open your mouth. You can't always control the thoughts you think, but you can control what you'll do with those thoughts, whether you'll dwell on them or whether you'll push them away. You can't always control the emotions that well up within you, but you can control whether or not you act on those emotions. You see how this works? You can't control what other people do. You can't control what they do to you. You can't control what they say about you, but you can control how you respond to them. David finds himself at a point in life where he feels a little bit out of control. There's a lot going on here that he can't stop and he can't change. So what David chose to do was to control himself. There's a great story here in chapter 15 as David is leaving the city. He's walking out of the city of Jerusalem and he turns around and he sees the priests are coming with him. And they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And so David stops the caravan and he goes back to the priests and he says, I want you to go back to Jerusalem. I want you to take the ark back to Jerusalem. That's where it belongs. But I want you to hear what he said after that, because these are powerful words. This is 2 Samuel 15:24. David says, if the Lord sees fit, he will bring me back to see the ark in the tabernacle. If it's God's will, if he thinks it's the right thing, he's going to bring me back to Jerusalem and I'll see the ark again. But if he is through with me, then let him do what seems best to him. David says, I don't know what's next. I don't know what's coming. I'm not in control here, but I know who is. I'm not in control of the upcoming battle, but I know who is. I'm not in control of my son who's out of control, but I know who is. And I know that I can trust him to do the right thing. Now here's the cool part about this story. 2 Samuel tells us that this happened somewhere between the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives. And we know that this is a really important place in Scripture because that's where the Garden of Gethsemane is located, between the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives. So do you see what's happening here? It's very possible that this moment where David is sending the ark back to Jerusalem, he's in the same place as Jesus was when Jesus knelt to pray the night before he died. And you remember Jesus' words there? Father, please take this from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but yours. Almost identical to what David is saying. Saying, God, I don't want to go through this, but I trust your will. You see, when we go through life, we are always going to be confronted by what we can't control. It's going to happen. And when we find ourselves in those places where life is out of control, or someone around me is out of control, and I certainly don't have control, we must remind ourselves I'm out of control here. I can't change this, but I know who can. And I know that he will do the right thing, and I can trust him. That's David. I can't control what Absalom is doing. I can't control this war. I can't control this rebellion. So what can I control? I can trust in God. I can believe that he is going to do the right thing, and I can patiently wait to see what's next. But David didn't stop there. David also courageously acted. Because if we want to trust God in terrifying times, it's not just about taking control for ourselves and controlling what we can control, but it's also about focusing on others. If you look around, you are going to see people who need help. In fact, no matter how bad your life may be, you can always find someone who has it worse. That's why it's important in these times of fear to look around and say, how can I focus on others? How can I help others? Because this amazing thing happens when I begin to focus on others, I take my focus off myself. When I begin to invest my energy in meeting the needs of other people, I stop worrying about all these needs that I have. When I start asking, how can I help you, I stop asking, what if? If I want to trust God, if I want to take courageous action, I need to begin focusing on others. Here's how that looked for David. David realized he couldn't control Absalom. He couldn't control the size of the army that was marching towards Jerusalem. He couldn't control the fact that the people had abandoned him. And so he said, what can I control? I can focus on the people around me. And so David began to protect and provide for those around him. He gathered his family. He gathered his fighting men. He said, let's get out of here. Let me make sure that you are safe. He took action by focusing on others. But it went beyond that for David. As they were leaving the city, one man whose name was Shimei came out and began to just hurl insults at David. Just everything awful he could imagine to say, he would yell at him, telling him, David, the judgment of God is on you for what you did to the house of Saul. God is out to destroy you. God hates you. David's men said, David, can we go kill this guy? Just shut him up. And David said, no, let him be. Who knows? Maybe God sent him here for a reason, and we'll just wait and see what God is doing here. Because for David, focusing on others wasn't just about providing and protecting for those closest to him. It was also about dealing graciously with his enemies. And it was also about listening to others. As David and his men reached safety, they began to prepare for battle because they knew it was coming. And David began to prepare for battle with them. But his men came to David and said, David, we don't want you to go into battle with us. Let us explain why. And so in 2 Samuel, chapter 18, this is what it says. His men objected strongly. You must not go, they urged. You are worth 10,000 of us, and it is better that you stay here in the town and send help if we need it. If you think that's the best plan, I'll do it, the king answered. Now this is David, right? This is the great warrior. Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. This is the guy that brought down Goliath. This is the guy who has never his entire life run from a fight. And his friends say, stay here, David. And David says, I'll do it. He listened. It's not always easy to hear people tell us what we don't want to hear, is it? Sometimes it's hard for us to listen when people are saying things that we don't agree with, or telling us to do something we don't want to do, or not do something that we want to do. There's this term, confirmation bias. Have you ever heard this term? It's the idea that one of the things that we do naturally is we're inclined to hear what we agree with and block out what we disagree with. And so as I'm collecting information, my natural inclination is to collect information that bolsters my view. And if I hear something that I disagree with, I just dismiss it or find a way to discredit it. This happens a lot in politics, doesn't it? People choose their news station based on which party they like. They choose which news is real news and which news is fake news based on whether or not it supports their candidate. And we're all prone to doing this. You see, in times of crisis, and that's where David is right now, in times of crisis, we are the least equipped to see things clearly and the most likely to make bad decisions. That's where David finds himself now. So it would have been very easy because he was in a time of crisis, because his life was out of control. I feel like I'm out of control of something here. We'll see if these guys can fix it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shut down for a second. When something happens that you can't control, you don't stress. Just find the thing you can control, and you move on. So where was it? Listen to others. When we're in times of crisis, we make bad decisions. If we only listen to the people who agree with us, we make bad decisions. If you only hear voices that tell you what you want to hear, you're in a very dangerous place. Because you are now in a place where you're not going to change. You're only willing to hear what you like. You're only willing to hear people who say, oh, you're doing great. And if you're not willing to change, you're not going to grow. You're going to stagnate in life. We need to hear from people who tell us what we don't want to hear. We need to hear from people who tell us things with which we disagree. Because that's the only way we can change, and it's the only way we can grow. That's one of the reasons why I encourage everybody to be part of a life group or to be part of some kind of a group where you're meeting with people and sharing your life with them so they can step into your life and tell you those hard truths sometime. See, in difficult times, the worst person you can trust is yourself. And if you want to trust God, you need to also trust God's people, because God's people sometimes speak to you for Him. David was willing to listen even though he really wanted to go and fight. His men went out to battle. They were victorious. God intervened. But Absalom was killed. And when the news reached David that his son was dead, he went into mourning, as I think all of us would. But before long, Joab came to David and said, David, I understand that you're mourning, but you need to rethink this. I want you to listen to what Joab says to David here. This is 2 Samuel 19. Then Joab went into the house to the king and said, today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now, go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now. Well, that Joab sure had a way of soothing pain, didn't he? Seems kind of harsh. Now remember, Joab was not a poet, he was a warrior. So he didn't really have a way with words. He's kind of harsh and brusque. That's who he was. But he was also a general. And he was concerned about his men. And here's the thing, he was right. These men that fought for David, they had just risked their lives. They had just watched their friends and their comrades die. They had just fought against their own countrymen, all because of Absalom. And the last thing they needed to know right now was that the king was mourning the death of their greatest enemy. Joab says to David, hey, I understand this hurts, but you've got to move on. You see, trusting God means we don't live in the basement of disappointment. If we want to trust God, we must leave the basement. Joab says to David, it's time for you to move forward. to take action. And listen to David's response, 1 Samuel 19:8. So the king went out and took his seat at the town gate. And as the news spread throughout the town that he was there, everyone went to him. David left the basement. Now listen. Grief is a good thing. It's okay to mourn. When bad things happen to us, it's all right to feel badly. God made us to feel those emotions, to process those emotions. In fact, the Bible tells us that God is grieved over the lost, and that Jesus mourned when his friend Lazarus died. Grief, mourning, sorrow, these are a part of life. And they are good, and they are natural, and they are necessary. But hear this. God did not create you to leave you in your grief. He has something better for you. And there is a time for mourning, Ecclesiastes tells us, but joy comes in the morning, right? It ends. And there's a time when you have to step out and say, now it's time for me to move on. Now, listen, I don't want to minimize your pain or your fear or your disappointment, because I don't know where you've been. I've not walked in your shoes. I've not experienced your life. I've not been through the same things that you've been through. Here's what I know. We have all experienced pain. Sometimes it's on a really small scale, right? I stubbed my toe. Maybe a little bit worse, but it kind of goes away after a little while. Sometimes it's on a massive scale, and it's life-altering, and it feels like it's never going to go away. This is the truth. We all have pain in our past. That's an experience we share. But we also share the experience of the cross, because Jesus died for every single one of us. That disappointment in your past may lead you into fear, may lead you to the what-if questions, but I want you to know that disappointment died at the cross. Your disappointments, your fear, your pain, maybe it led you to a place where you feel lost. I don't know what's next. I don't know what's coming. I don't know where I am. Jesus went to the cross to find you. And if you meet him at the cross, you are found. And maybe your disappointment or your pain or your fear has led you to think that you're a failure. Maybe it's something you brought on yourself, and you're thinking, I'm a failure. I've failed in life. Hear this. Jesus went to the cross and succeeded for you. So if you meet him at the cross, you are not a failure. You are a success. Maybe your disappointments have led you to a place of feeling unloved or unlovable. Do you know that the cross is the sign of God's love for you? God loved you so much that he sent his only son to pay the price for your sin so that he could be right with you. You see, you may not feel that anybody else can love you. You may not even feel that you can love yourself. But know that God loves you. And when you meet him at the cross, you are loved. If David had based his satisfaction, his contentment, his hope, his joy on earthly things like his kingdom, like his throne, like the praise of the people, then he would have been disappointed. And his disappointment would have led him into despair. But David's hope was in God. David's joy was in God. David's confidence was in God. And because of that, David's despair turned to delight. And his disappointment turned to deliverance. if your faith, if your trust, if your hope, if your confidence, if your joy, if your contentment is rooted in the things of this earth, popularity, possessions, pride, you're going to be disappointed. And your life will be marked by the what-if questions of fear. But if your hope, if your joy, if your contentment, if your satisfaction is rooted in God and what He has done for you and what He will do for you, then you will experience deliverance, and you will experience delight, and you will experience confidence. That is what it means to trust Him. Let's pray. Father, thank you for all you've done for us. Thank you that we know that Jesus made all things right at the cross, that He will carry through that promise for us in the future. Help us to wait patiently, but also to courageously take action as we trust in you. In your name, amen.